Okay. Then I'm going to hit share screen, my desktop. And here we have my PowerPoint. I'm going to disable my video. Okay. Can you all see my PowerPoint, Lori?
Yep.
Okay, great. Okay. So this is part one about literature reviews. This is mainly going to focus on research skills with it and also how to plan your literature review. So, have you ever said these out loud before? Someone has already talked about my topic and I have nothing new to say. Or you might have said, I don't know where my sources are supposed to go in my paper. Or my favorite one, am I doing it right? Well, there's no clear yes or no answer to all of these questions. However, we can start thinking about them and think about how you might plan out your literature review. Oops. So what is the purpose of a literature review? They serve several different functions. First is that it summarizes, evaluates, and compares original research in a specific area, especially as a starting point for new research. So it's sort of a historical chronicle of what has been done within the field. It places your current research in the context of past research. So again, it shows where you lie along that continuum of research in your field. It highlights the focal point of your own research by choosing specific sources to focus on. It demonstrates the ability to critically evaluate relevant sources and incorporate them into your work. And also, it can identify inconsistencies, gaps, and contradictions in the literature in preparation for new research. So it shows sort of different problems that are within the field. Okay, so while you're getting started, it's important that you define your subject, your research questions, and your scope. So how general do you want to have your topic, or are you focused on something very specific? With that in mind, you need to find sources that are suitable and relevant. Then you analyze and interpret these sources you selected in terms of how they relate to your research. And this process can be used to develop your thesis. And it's important that you take note of any patterns or subtopics you find, such as research trends, prominent theories, common or opposing findings, and others. And then what you do is select the appropriate organizational strategy that suits your findings or predetermined writing needs. So a quick diversion, talking about research questions. They're very important. It's important to have a good research question because you use that to do your research. So for example, let's say you have the question, what is the effect of caffeine on the brain? From this question, we can generate different keywords that you use to search for your topic. So we have from this caffeine, brain, and then things associated with caffeine, things like coffee, tea. You can even add in chocolate with it. So this is sort of like a little pre-strategy you can use to generate these keywords, which you will then go to search for things relevant to your topic. We'll be returning to this later. Okay, so back in here. So why is evaluating your sources important? So some people think, oh, I'm just going to go online, Google, and just find everything that relates to my source. Well, not all sources are created equal. Some sources are very credible, very worthy, yet some can destroy your entire work because the quality of your sources directly impacts the quality of your literature review. So if you have good sources, you most likely will have a good literature review, but one bad source can ruin your whole thesis or dissertation. So what exactly do you evaluate? Well, you want to know what type of source it is, who the authors of the source are, where the source is located, and how old the source is. So first, let's go into the two main types of sources, primary and secondary sources. You probably have heard about these before, so this is just sort of like a review. A primary source provides direct or firsthand evidence about an event, phenomenon, object, person, or work of art. An example of this could be a journal entry by soldiers during World War II. So it's sort of directly tied to an event, right? Different from that is a secondary source, which describes, discusses, interprets, comments on, analyzes, evaluates, summarizes, and processes primary sources. So it's one step removed. An example of this could be a history book interpreting the emotions of soldiers in wartime based on the journal entries described above. So some examples of primary sources: news and magazine articles that report firsthand or eyewitness accounts of an event, or maybe live video that records an event. Things like diaries, journals, letters, government records like census, marriage, or military details. For the hard sciences, published results of research studies, experiments, and clinical trials. Whereas for secondary sources, there are things like biographies of people, history books, book, art, and theater reviews, interpretations of literature, and even other academic literature reviews. So you might be thinking, well, I don't want to use secondary sources. I only want to use primary sources. But that's not necessarily what you should do, because really good secondary sources, such as biographies or history books, can provide an expert view into a topic. And so you'll see with a lot of theses and dissertations, it's a mix of primary and secondary sources. However, you wouldn't necessarily want to use only secondary sources, because if you do that, you sort of um, miss a chance to analyze the work yourself. So again, it should be a good mix of the two. Okay, following from that, you should look at who the author or authors are of it. So you want to look at what is the education of the author. Do they have a PhD? Where did they get their degree from? Very importantly, what are their publications? What have they studied in the field? Where do their publications occur? You want to look at the different academic positions they've held. Do they work in a university? Do they work in industry? How long is their experience in the field? Have they been active for decades? Are they just getting started? Is it one person? Is it a group of people? Or is it an organization? Um, Nowadays, it's common to have studies that have about 100 different authors on it, and it sort of functions as a research team, and this is normal. Or sometimes it's actually an organization that publishes a study, and so you don't see the individual people, but it's still a credible organization. Sometimes you cannot find out who the author is. So maybe like an anonymous blog, if you treat that as a primary source. You have to ask yourself, though, why don't I know who the author is? Are they trying to hide their identity? Do they know that the work is not good? So maybe that is a cause for suspicion, but not necessarily. You also want to see who the publisher of the source is. What is their criteria for publication? What type of things do they typically publish? And what kind of reputation do they have? So we have two things here. NPR stands for National Public Radio. It's considered to be a very credible media source in the US. Whereas on the left, we have Weekly World News. This is what we call a tabloid. It frequently publishes sensational news items, or as we say nowadays, fake news. So these type of sources you want to be careful about when you're finding your source. You also want to think about how old the source is. So you want to analyze your topic to determine if a source from 20 years ago will be as accurate as one from 2 months ago. And so you should think about your topic, how it would benefit from recent publications, and what topics would benefit from older sources. For example, if you're tracing the history of something, um, you might want to look at older sources up through now. If you're talking about an event in history, you would want sources that are close to that point in time. However, if you're talking about the latest scientific breakthroughs, you might want to have the newest sources that you can find. Now, where can you find these sources? Um, I talk about this with my students. Typically, the safest place you can find for a credible source is a peer-reviewed journal. A peer-reviewed journal is an academic publication in which the articles have been reviewed and verified by other scholars such as professors. So I had to submit an article to a peer-reviewed journal. So what I would do is I would hand in my draft, and then a group of editors, typically professors, would read through my work, and they would either reject it or they would send it back to me and said, we think we might be able to publish this, but you need to check this, this, and this. And they do this as a way to ensure that whatever they publish is of the highest quality. Now, occasionally bad articles do appear in journals, but it's considered rare. And so if a journal is well established and it says that it's peer reviewed, you can generally trust the source. Another good source are dissertation databases. And these are source aggregates that hold published dissertations, which are academic studies the scholar performs to attain a doctoral degree. Dissertations, as you know, you submit to a group of professors who analyzes it and then gives the approval for it to be published and you attain your degree. So they're maybe not as safe as peer-reviewed journal articles, but they're still generally of very high quality. And you can go to sites such as ProQuest to search for different dissertations on your topic. Other places where you might find sources. .gov websites are for governments, and those can be used to find statistics. .edu are educational institutions, such as the Purdue OWL, where you can find information about different style guides. And then we have .org and .com websites. Before .org was considered to be more credible than a .com, but nowadays we can kind of consider them equal in stature. I don't want to say they're bad places to get information because sometimes you can find very safe articles with it. But in terms of quality, it varies a lot. And so you want to be more careful about obtaining a source from, say, a .org or .com website. Okay, before we move on, I just want to show you Google Scholar. Some of you might have used this before to search for different topics. It's great. One thing you can have is a library where if you click a star, it will save your source where you can return to it later. It also has an advanced search function. So if you go to advanced search, so let's say we want to search for articles that talk about caffeine, tea, and the brain. However, I'm sick of learning about coffee, so we're going to remove the word coffee from the article, hit search, and you see that it brings up many different results. So You can star a result. If you click the star, you can save it. This shows you the citation information. I kind of don't recommend that you use it because it can be inaccurate. Then we have this cited by 32. That means that at least 32 other publications have used this source. Generally, the higher the number, the more credible this source is because a lot of different scholars have used it in their work. And sometimes it shows you where the source might be located. So this shows that you can find the PDF here, and here's the article for you to download for your use. So Google Scholar, very useful search engine. Okay. Now, going about organizing the literature, there are a few different ways that you can do this. You can do it chronologically, which, as you can see, is by time. You can do it thematically, which is by theme. And you can do it methodologically, which is by method, among many others, which let me show you right here. Open this up. So as you can see, there's many different ways you can actually organize literature. Typically, people organize it by subtopic within your research question or thesis statement. Typically, you see things like 3 important areas of this field have received attention, A, B, and C. Very common. You can organize it by debate, which is similar to by topic, but one person will say something, and then a group of people will say something else, and then a group of people will say something else. Again, chronologically, you talk about who did it first, then who did it second, who did it third. Or you can talk about a seminal study. So in some fields, there is one study that is very important, and then you include the literature that responds to that study. So down here, you see 2 different examples. So it starts off, 3 important aspects of this field have received extended critical attention. Length of time students spend on writing literature reviews, the amount of revision typically required by thesis advisors, and the extent to which highlighters help or hinder the review process. So that's 3 themes that the person found within their thesis topic. Or what you might do is organize it chronologically. So this subject was first studied by Smith in 1910. Then in 1955, this finding was contradicted. Then after the influx of large number of students in the 1960s, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. It's not necessarily that one method is correct and one is incorrect. It all depends on what you're trying to answer with your literature review. Are you tracing the history of something, or are you talking about the different themes that you find within your topic? Typically, the most common is by topic, which we will get into very shortly. But that's easy to do with, say, 5 sources. But how about with 25 sources? Or in my case, I have over 100 sources in my dissertation. How am I going to juggle all of these numbers together? I need a tool. I need some help. Because otherwise, your annotated bibliography, your literature review is going to look like this. Author 1 talks about this, this, and this. He then talks about this. I think he is right because he answered my thesis, which is blah, blah, blah. Author 2 talks about this, this, and this. She then talks about this. I think she is right because she answered my thesis, which is blah, blah, blah. Author 3 talks about this, this, and this. He then talks about this. I think he is kind of right because he kind of answered my thesis, which is blah, 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 and so on and so forth. This is fine for an annotated bibliography where you're just listing your sources, but this is not a good paper. It's just throwing different sources at you but there's no story, there's no narrative going on. What you need to do is you need to think about how to synthesize your sources. So rather than just forcing your sources into the paper to fit the requirements, what you should be doing instead is fitting your sources together so that the whole is more than just the sum of its parts. What do I mean? Well, look at this cat. It's not really a cat. It's actually made of little Lego blocks, but the different pieces are put together in such a way that we have this beautiful work of art made out of these distinct elements. In the same way, your paper needs to make sense by fitting in all of these different sources in together. Sounds difficult, right? Well, that's why we have some help. One tool you can use to do this, it's called a source matrix. It's not as cool as the movie The Matrix, but it's still pretty cool. Let me explain. What you do is, as you're reading and you're making notes about your sources, you might notice that some words follow a similar theme. And so you label that theme. So let's say we have a label here called critical thinking and writing. You created that label because you noticed some common things among the sources. For example, Swider said writing contributes to critical thinking. Jones said writing stimulates critical thought. And Smith said critical thinking and writing are linked in a study. Those all fall under a title, critical thinking and writing. Now, importantly, there are differences between them, and you should write about those differences. For example, Swider thought writing was the most important contributor to critical thinking, whereas Jones thought reading was more important. And Smith claims different types of writing stimulate different levels of critical thinking. However, the common thing found among all of them is that critical thinking and writing are interlinked. And source matrices can get really large. So, for example, in this topic of anxiety in graduate students, we find some major themes in here, like multiple roles, relationships, and the classroom environment. So you could see on the left column, they listed all of their different sources. And then from that, they found different pieces of information that fit each role. Note that for some sources, they found a piece of information for each topic, whereas for other sources, they only found one. Don't try to fit a source into each topic, because then you're misrepresenting the data. But this can help you see patterns among different sources. So a bunch of these sources fit under multiple roles of the graduate student. Many sources fit under relationships, and many sources fit under classroom environment. So in this way, you find the different sub-themes within your topic. This will be important as you write it later on. So how exactly do you find your theme within it? Well, one little trick you can do is called coding for themes. So a strategy you can use to find common themes and topics among sources is to develop codes for passages that revolve around a theme. You can later use these codes to develop different sections of your paper. Easy way to do this is to just highlight a section of text that you read, give it a color, and label the color with a short phrase that summarizes what the section discusses. Let me show you. Okay, so I copy and pasted this from Wikipedia, article about English, And this section was English as a global language. So this part around here talked a lot about colonialism and English. And I thought, this seems to be a unique theme. I'm going to color it red, and I'm going to give it the title English and Colonialism. The next paragraph talks a lot about how English is used as a global language. So I thought, I'm going to color this green, and I'm going to give it the label English and Global Communication. And then later on, as I'm reading, I see this one section and it talks about how English relates to other languages. So I think, okay, let me color this blue and I'll give it the title English and Other Languages. When I go to my next source, if I'm studying English as a language, if I find a section that talks about how English was used as a colonial language, I'm going to highlight that section as red so that I know that it fits with the sub-theme, English and colonialism, that I myself created, right? I'll say it again. These codes you create yourself. You decide what the sub-theme is based upon the different sources that you're reading. This way, it helps you see the connections among all the sources so that you can synthesize them later as you're writing your essay. I can't stress how important this is when you're setting up your essay because it gives your essay the foundations it needs for you to add on to it and for it to make sense. So coding and these source matrices, they can really save you a lot of time when you're writing your essay. And with that, I just want to emphasize that researching is recursive, which means that you come back to it again and again. So you plan and research, which leads to you reading and analyzing things, which leads you to draft and synthesize your sources. But then as you revise and reorganize it, you find that you need to do more planning and researching, more reading, et cetera, et cetera. The only time this stuff stops is when it's time for you to hand in your work to your advisor or professor. But otherwise, you might be finding new material all the way up to the due date. So again, researching is something that continuously goes on during the writing process. And speaking of that, so part 2 will be actually covering writing techniques with the lit review. And that is on February 1st at 5 p.m. this time. During that, I'll be talking about what is the CARS method for the introduction in literature review, choosing the right strategy for your in-text citations. So there's different ways that you can write about your sources, using transitions effectively in your paper, and different strategies for paraphrasing. And again, my name is James Swider. You can type in my name into Gmail if you want access to this material. I only ask that you save it for yourself and don't publish it on any website.